Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, tonight to another great Queensland branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs events. At the outset, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, pay my respect to the past, present and emerging whose sovereignty never ceded. Can I thank you all? Can I thank and acknowledge the presence tonight of Rachel Drew, the State Managing Partner of Holding Redlich. Not only, of course, do they host us here very generously, but thank you for the giving us a couple of platters tonight too. There's a lot of hungry students here and hungry old people here like myself who've enjoyed that. Can I welcome in particular our guest speaker tonight, the Honourable George Brandis, KC. I know when I first met George because I was a few years below George at school, and I remember he was in the Villanova College its academic team, so he was obviously destined for great things early. But George is a graduate of both the University of Queensland and Magdalen College, Oxford. After private practice as a barrister, he served 18 years in the Australian Senate and served as a Minister for the Arts and Sport in the Howard government, Attorney General and Minister for Arts in the Abbott government, and Attorney General and Leader of the government in the Senate in the Turnbull government. He retired from politics in 2018 to become Australian High Commissioner from Australia to the United Kingdom, and since returning to Australia in 2022, he's been Professor in Practice of National Security at the Australian National University National Security College. He also writes a fortnightly column for the Sydney Morning Herald. George has agreed tonight to speak on his topic is UK politics from chaos to calmer waters, but he is the sort of person, for anyone who knows him, that he'll take a question on anything, frankly. But we won't ask him questions on anything, but certainly you may have questions about Europe in its broader context, and I've checked with him. He's more than happy to speak, in a broader context about Europe if that's of interest to you at all in question time. So without any further ado, can I hand over to George?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul, and I'm flattered by the big turnout on such a miserable evening, but I hope that I'll be able to shed a little bit of light on the mysteries of UK politics, which have been very much in the news lately. Not perhaps as much as American politics for obvious reasons, but nevertheless there's been a lot going on in the United Kingdom. And by that I don't just mean the election, which saw the Labour Party elected at the most spectacular election victory the UK Labour Party has ever enjoyed. I'll come back to that. I started my 4-year posting as the Australian High Commissioner in London at the beginning of May of 2018. Theresa May was the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was the Foreign Secretary, although he was shortly to resign as the Foreign Secretary in order to go to the backbench and start to marshal his challenge to Theresa May. Nobody had heard of Rishi Sunak. It was less than 3 years since Keir Starmer had been elected to Parliament. He was only elected in 2015. And I have to say that I have never seen a political system in such a mess. It was terrible. And the reason it was terrible was because in the 2017 election, which Theresa May had called when her popularity was absolutely astronomical. She had an approval rating of slightly above 80% at one stage. And it was a cautionary tale about politics. Don't assume that because you've got an astronomical approval rating, you can pull on an early election and the public will forgive you. In the 2017 UK election, Theresa May, who I had known when she was Home Secretary and I was, as Attorney General, responsible for a lot of the same portfolio areas in Australia, so I'd got to know Theresa quite well before in that earlier capacity. She actually lost the Conservative Party's majority. at the 2017 election, and the only way they were able to form a government was by doing a deal with their affiliate party in Northern Ireland, the Democratic Unionist Party. On the 23rd of June 2016, British people had voted to leave the European Union. And throughout my time in the United Kingdom, and since too, right up to the election last month, the politics of the United Kingdom have been dominated by one issue above all else, and that is the issue of Brexit. Just to remind you of the history, Britain joined the European Union or the European Economic Community, as it was then called, on the 1st of January 1973. It was led into that, what was essentially then a free trade bloc, by the Conservative government of Edward Heath. In those days, most Conservatives were in favour of Britain being a member of the EEC, and the Labor Party was very divided on the issue. The left of the Labor Party was vigorously opposed to the idea. The more conservative, or the right of the Labor Party, the more mainstream Labor people of the day were in favour. So when Harold Wilson, as leader of the opposition, went to the 1974 British election, promising a referendum on whether or not Britain should continue with its membership of the EEC. Harold Wilson won the election, to everybody's surprise, and he held the referendum later in 1974, and the result was 67% voted to remain in the EEC and 33% voted to leave. So there was as overwhelming a consensus as you are ever likely to find over a very contested issue, that Britain's future lay in Europe. And of course, Australia was one of the victims of that decision, because Britain ceased to be, as it had been, our biggest trading partner, and in particular, our commodities markets, particularly our agricultural markets, disappeared. Fast forward to 2016, 40 years later. By that time, the Conservative Party were savagely divided over the question of Europe. The Labor Party was not divided particularly, although some of the hard left, like Jeremy Corbyn, their former leader, were against European membership, because Corbyn, who was a kind of the successor of Tony Benn and Michael Foot as the leader of the left of the Labor Party, regarded the European Union, as it then was called, as a capitalist conspiracy. But overwhelmingly, the Labor Party was in favour of remaining in Europe. I think every member of Sir Keir Starmer's cabinet today was what you would call a Remainer. He certainly is. The Tories were fratricidally divided over Europe, however. So David Cameron, foolishly, and against the urgings of a lot of his senior people, particularly the Chancellor, George Osborne, decided to copy what Wilson had done in 1974 to try and resolve an internal party dispute by having, we call it a referendum, it was actually a plebiscite, but you know what I mean, by having a plebiscite on European membership. Bad mistake, and a cautionary tale for politicians. No matter how intractable the internal party dispute is, whatever you do, don't try and solve it by a referendum. Because you never know what might happen. It might blow up in your face, which is precisely what happened to David Cameron. He resigned within 24 hours. The unexpected result, unexpected by most, and partly responsible the consequence, by the way, of David Cameron's own complacency about the outcome. 51.9% voted to leave, 48.1% voted to remain. A lot of the leavers were what we today call shy Tories. They didn't want to admit that they were going to vote to leave because the unanimity of what you might call respectable opinion, the City of London, almost all the newspapers, almost all the commentariat were fervently in favour of remaining. David Cameron, of course, was fervently in favour of remaining. So was his successor, Theresa May. So was Liz Truss too, by the way, at the time. But this result took them completely by surprise. Poor Theresa May inherited a mess that was not of her making. It was absolutely not her fault. And I know Theresa May pretty well. She's a nicer person you would not meet in a month of Sundays. But she was completely incapable of managing the issue. And having lost her majority at the 2017 election, which she foolishly called too soon, her authority was destroyed in two ways. First of all, obviously she had been politically poleaxed by going from a very strong position and a very high level of popularity to losing her majority in the space of a few weeks. But of course, also in Brussels, the headquarters of the EU, where Britain was seeking to negotiate the terms of withdrawal or exit, her negotiating position was destroyed because whatever she wanted to do, or a lot of what any government had to do to get out of Europe, required legislation. And I would sit in the House of Commons. One thing I'd never had anything to do with diplomacy before. I'd never had a foreign affairs related role when I was in Parliament. This was all new to me. But one thing I decided to do, which I think was a good thing to do, is I used to go down to the House of Commons for all the very big debates. And the diplomats gallery in the House of Commons sits directly above the opposition. So you are looking directly at the government front bench. So it's literally the best seat in the House. And I would go down at some of these crucial votes, and the government was defeated by majorities of more than 100. On one occasion, it was defeated by a majority of more than 200, because so many Tories voted opportunistically to try and bring Theresa May down, and the Labor Party voted against her as well, of course, as did the minor parties. And it was a pathetic sight. I mean, this was a government, this was the worst, most frightening example, actually, of a government in office but not in power. And because this issue was the only issue in town politically, every vote was effectively a vote of confidence in the government. But because some years earlier, as the price of a coalition with the Lib Dems, David Cameron had agreed to a piece of legislation called the Fixed Term Parliament Act, the government couldn't dissolve the parliament and go back to the people, because the requirements of the Fixed Term Parliament Act required a very high special majority, I think it was 75%, to have an election out of term for the end of the regular term. So you had this really terrible, I mean, literally pathetic sight of a disempowered Prime Minister, a government with no authority, completely incapable of getting its key legislation through. Every time it was defeated, meanwhile, its negotiating position in Brussels was reduced to ashes because the government couldn't deliver on any commitment that it made to its negotiating counterparties. It was a shocking situation. Meanwhile, in the background, well, not actually in the background, but in a very public way, Boris Johnson, who in June, I think, had opportunistically resigned as foreign minister, was making all the trouble he could. Eventually, May's position became untenable, and in the middle of 2019, she resigned, and Boris Johnson defeated Jeremy Hunt, who you would know of, the former Foreign Secretary and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, he defeated him very easily, actually, in a membership ballot for the leadership of the Conservative Party. Well, that's when the Tories, to use the old phrase, went to the races. Because Boris, who I also got to know quite well, is a complete phenomenon. Nobody is neutral about Boris Johnson. There are only two views about Boris Johnson that are available. You either love him or you absolutely despise him. I happen to love him. I find him one of the most impressive, charismatic, capable political figures that I've ever encountered. But he is also incredibly undisciplined and reckless. And that was to be the source of his undoing. But nevertheless, Boris Johnson had one particular thing that he brought, and that was he had cut through to working class Englishmen. Not Scotsmen. Scotsmen hated him, almost universally. But he had this cut through to working class Englishmen. Now, I guess most people in this room are somewhat familiar with the United Kingdom, so you know that, broadly speaking, the north of England is poor and the southwest of England is relatively prosperous. There were seats in the north of England that had never voted for any party other than the Labour Party since Sir Keir Hardie, or not Sir Keir, Keir Hardie, the founder of the British Labour Party, was elected to the House of Commons in 1906. These were called the Red Wall seats. They were banned across the north and northwest of England. And there were about 50 or 60 of them. It was a given that no matter how badly the Labour Party did, they would always have the Red Wall. Boris Johnson won almost every seat, almost every seat in the Red Wall, because Boris has this capacity not to seem part of the establishment. He went to Eton. He was a scholarship boy at Eton. He was a King's Scholar. He went to Oxford. David Cameron went to Eton and Oxford. But David Cameron was a toff. He was a toff. He looked like a toff. He sounded like a toff. He was a toff. One of Boris Johnson's great appeals was he actually isn't a toff. He's kind of, if he was a toff, he was a naughty toff. He was relatable. It was almost as if the worse he behaved, the more the public, wanted to spank him, but they always forgave him until he took it too far during COVID. He was never, ever, ever, ever condescending. He had this, I have never seen a politician more cut through. So Boris tricked Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, into going along with the idea of an early election at the end of 2019. So Labour voted for it, and the Lib Dems voted for it, which was like the turkeys voting for Christmas, and the Tories voted for it, and they got the special majority that the Fixed Term Parliament Act required. And Johnson called an election for, I think it was the 12th of December 2019. The campaign was run, as it usually is by Victoria's, by an Australian. Most of Boris's campaigns had been run by a guy called Linton Crosby, who used to be the federal director of the Liberal Party, who ran John Howard's 1998 and 2001 campaigns. The 2017 campaign wasn't run by Linton, it was run by another young Australian called Isaac Levito, who had worked for Linton. And let me share a funny story with you, which I had not from Isaac Levito himself. Boris has no friends, because people like that don't have friends. But to the extent to which he has any friends, his only friend in the world is kind of Linton Crosby. Even when he was in extremis and Linton was living in retirement at his farm in Bowral, Boris was ringing him every day saying, what should I do? What should I do? So Boris asked Linton to run the 2019 election campaign for him. And Linton said, look, I'd like to help you, Boris, but look, I'm too old, my wife's sick, I don't have it in me. So no. And Boris said, well, what am I going to do? I mean, what am I going to do? And Linton said to him, well, look, there's this young guy who's worked for me called Isaac Levito. He's really good. Get him to run it for you. So Boris contacts Isaac Levito, who he's never heard of, invites him into 10 Downing Street and says to him, look, Linton Crosby is a very good friend of mine. He recommends you very strongly. And Isaac Levito he's a very kind of quiet, understated person with what I would call assassin's eyes. He's the sort of person who in a very, very quiet way is immensely effective. And he said to Boris, well, thank you, Prime Minister. I'll accept this on one condition. Boris says, oh, okay, what's that? That I have to have total control. I've worked with the Conservative Party before. Your operation is complete shit. It's the worst run political party I've ever seen in my life. Your senior officials are gentlemen amateurs. I'm not going to put up with any of that. If you want me to do this, I have to have total control over everything. This is music to Boris's ears because he has the same view of the Conservative Party organisation. And he picks up the phone and rings Lord Thingy Bob, the chairman of the Conservative Party, and he says, look, I've just appointed the campaign director. His name is Isaac Levito. Immediately raises suspicions. His name is Isaac Levito. I've told him he has total control of the campaign. Make sure he has it. So Isaac runs a textbook perfect campaign and comes up with a textbook perfect slogan, which you may remember. The slogan is, get Brexit done. The reason it's a brilliant slogan is because it appealed to both sides. For obvious reasons, it appealed to the people who wanted to leave, but it also appealed to most of the people who had voted to remain. Because, and you'd have to really live in the UK at this time to get this, it was such a divisive issue. It divided families, it terminated marriages. It was the only thing people had been able to talk about for years, and there were only 2 points of view. And the whole civil society was having a heart attack about this. So when Johnson said, get Brexit done, even the Remainers thought, for God's sake, let's get this behind us. Let us put this behind us. So apart from a few hardcore people of that point of view, it's what everybody wanted to hear. And Boris, who's a brilliant campaigner, prosecuted this argument stunningly, won a majority of 80 seats in a 650-member House of Commons, biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher after the First World War. And it was a sight to see. I was at the Conservative Party headquarters that night at the party. It was a sight to see. He had everything before him. The problem with Boris, though, as I said before, is he's an extremely undisciplined person. And another problem, which is always a problem for a politician, but it kind of goes with the territory, he had over the years accumulated a lot of enemies among the MPs. So while the rank and file of the party continued to adore him, a lot of MPs who had been on the Remain side of the argument or had just sort of seen Boris up close and thought that he was particularly ruthless even by Conservative Party standards, loathed him. Which meant that when, after COVID happened, he continued to behave in an undisciplined way, particularly with the parties you would have all read about. A lot of that was exaggerated, by the way, but there was just enough in it to get traction. Ordinarily, that wouldn't have been enough to destroy a Prime Minister. But because there were so many people, there was a long queue of people with knives waiting to plunge between his shoulder blades once they got an opportunity, the herd shifted and his position was made untenable. Then we had the brief interregnum of Liz Truss. And then we had the very unsuccessful Prime Ministership of Rishi Sunak, who was never be able to relate to people. I mean, he married into the richest family in India, so he was never going to be very good in the relatability stakes. And his image, Rishi's image was, he was Davos man. He was the supremely omnicompetent, highly intelligent technocrat with no political X factor whatsoever. Starmer, meanwhile, had fought, to his great credit, Starmer was elected as leader of the Labor Party after the 2019 election, having been in Parliament for only 4 years. Very smart man. He fought a really ruthless civil war within the Labor Party against the hard left, who continued to yearn for Jeremy Corbyn, the old Trotskyite, which he won. Starmer, although, most people, and Paul, I think, will probably agree with me about this, most people who come into politics take quite a while to get the hang of how politics works. That didn't seem to be the case with Starmer. He ran this absolutely ruthless civil war against the Labor left, drove them out of the party. They gave him a lot of material to work with. An internal Labor Party inquiry convicted Corbyn of being an anti-Semite, and Starmer immediately took advantage of that to expel him. And he looked increasingly, as the Tory party looked more and more like a shambles. He actually started to look like the villain up in the room. It didn't do any harm that he had the pre-nominal. He'd been the DPP, and the knighthood comes with the job. But the other thing about Keir Starmer, which you would have noticed if you've seen him on television, is he's the ultimate straight man. He's really boring. And that works so well for him because and this sort of goes to the theme of my talk, after this circus, this spectacular circus that basically began with the destruction of David Cameron's government over Brexit and then the collapse of Boris Johnson's government over Boris's indiscretions and the Tory civil wars more broadly. What the British people wanted was a period of calm. And that's exactly what they got with Starmer. His nickname was a palindrome, a spoonerism, I should say, steer calmer. And I was not at all surprised when he won the election as handsomely as he did. In fact, Kwasi Kwarteng, who had been the Chancellor of the Exchequer during the Breville-Stard Truss government and brought down the disastrous mini budget, who I saw in London a couple of weeks ago, said to me, "Oh, so relieved when we discovered we were going to win 121 seats." Because, I mean, there are some polls that show that the Tories might actually get down to about 60. And at one point, they were in a race for second place with the Lib Dems. Now, the final figures were the Labor Party gained 218 seats to win 411. They ended up not quite as many as Tony Blair in 1997. Tony Blair won 418 seats. But Starmer came from a lower base because only one election before, in 2019, the Labor Party got its worst result since the 1930s. So in one cycle, he took them from their worst results since the 1930s to their second best result in history. So he actually picked up more seats this year than Blair had picked up in 1997. The Conservative Party, as I said, won 121 seats. They lost 252. The big winners other than the Labor Party were the Lib Dems. There was a lot of tactical voting in very safe Tory seats in the south of England. They went from 8 seats to 72, their best ever result. And the Lib Dems are a kind of mongrel party that came from an amalgamation of the old Liberal Party with the Social Democrats, who broke out from the Labor Party in the 1980s under Shirley Williams and people like that. Some of you might recall, and then subsequent years gone by merged. But I mean, the old Liberal, they still are kind of the ghost of the old Liberal Party of Asquith and Lloyd George. So it's hard to make a direct comparison. Lloyd George at the 1919 election won a huge number of seats. But this is the best the Lib Dems had ever done since then, the Liberals had ever done since then. So going from 8 to 72 is pretty good. Almost all in safe Tory constituencies, by the way, in the south. One other result of the election was the near destruction of the Scottish National Party, who had 2 elections previously won all but 3 of the 58 seats in Scotland. There were 55 SNP, 1 Tory, 1 Liberal, and 1 Labor. The Labor Party, which had historically been very strong in Scotland, won all those seats back. So the SNP lost 39 seats and was down to 9. And finally, I should wind up because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. You'll want to hear a word about Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage, I'm looking at this audience and I'm thinking, you probably don't watch Paul Murray on Sky News. But I do. And he has, and I know Nigel Farage as well. Not very well, though. But I mean, there is a Nigel Farage does have a capacity for cut through and speaking the language of the common man in a very direct and memorable and in a sort of dodgy, con-manish way, charismatic style. He won 5 seats. But, of course, that doesn't for a moment tell you his impact on the election. His party across the entire country won 14.3% of the vote. The Tories won 23.7% of the vote. There was a multiplicity of opinion polls during the election campaign, but one of them, which I thought was particularly striking, predicted that of the people who voted Conservative at the 2019 election, which was a high watermark, the people who voted Conservative at the 2019 election, half would vote Conservative this time a quarter would vote Labor or the Lib Dems. There's the swinging voters, obviously. And a quarter would vote for Farage. That's pretty much what happened. Now, remember, this is a country with first past the post voting. So Farage's 15% of the vote made a massive difference in safe Tory seats by taking that big a slice off the top of the Tory vote. I asked Isaac what his estimate was of the number of seats, safe seats, the Tories lost to Labor or the Lib Dems because their vote was cannibalised by Reform, the Farage party. He said, oh, look, it's hard to say. I think conservatively at least 60, perhaps 80. And when you only win 121 seats, the impact of losing 60 to 80 of your safe seats, you don't have to be a sort of have the Nobel Prize in mathematics to work out what that means. That's one of many reasons, by the way, I think the Tories committed the greatest act of political self-harm I've ever seen by getting rid of Boris Johnson. There's one thing about Boris, whether you love him or loathe him, is Farage was scared of him. Farage had run Parliament 7 times before and lost for the House of Commons. Even in week 2 of the election campaign, he was very hesitant about whether he would run because he was looking for a media career in the States under the Trump presidency, as he expected it to be. But he was also a bit, gun shy, having lost 7 times before. He only made up his mind to run at the last minute after a lot of hesitation. There is no possibility that he would have run if Boris was the Prime Minister. No possibility at all. And without Farage, the Reform Party is nothing. So for that reason alone, I think Johnson probably would have lost the election. In fact, I'm sure he would have, but he would have saved a lot more of the furniture. Now, I've spoken for a little longer than I planned, or I haven't bored you, but there are a lot more things I could say about sort of media. I thought you might like a few anecdotes, but I could talk about media issues like AUKUS and the Free Trade Agreement and various other things. But I thought, you'd just like to hear about politics, so that was it.
Very good. On the contrary, George, a cracker of a speech. We might have to get you back for some other things then as well. But question time is now, and we'll shortly take questions from the audience. Longer of the first question is to the chair, so I get and we'll also take some online. We'll have some online. I just ask you to remember with respect to questions, they're questions, not statements. And we do like to not have all old white blokes like me asking questions. We particularly encourage younger members of the audience to ask questions as well. My proposition, or my question to you, George, is this. When Labor had its devastating loss in Scotland to the SNP, the chalking campaign was London Labor, representing the fact that they no longer Scottish people they didn't relate to anymore. Recently, and Alexander Down has written about this, we've seen those terrible racial riots in Britain. Yet Britain has about 16% of its population born overseas. We have 29.9% of our population born overseas. Yet we seem to have social cohesion that they don't. Can you shed some light on the demography of the UK in a political and social sense? Some of your observations on that?
Yes, I can. So the short answer to your question is we do multiculturalism a lot better than they do. A lot better. And one of the reasons we do multicultural, well, there are lots of reasons, so let me go through them. First of all, the debate about population policy in the United Kingdom is a debate both about the composition of the population, but it's also about size. So the UK's population at the moment is about 68 million. It's grown by about 5 million in the last 10 years. More, actually, slightly more. As you know, it's a crowded place. In the debate about population size in Australia, the argument is about how much bigger we should be. There are some who say 50 million, there are some who say 40 million, there are some who say 30 million, but almost nobody says we shouldn't grow at all. In the United Kingdom, the debate is, should we grow at all, or are we already too crowded? So it's a completely different sort of debate, and you can understand that. Super added to that, and we have this debate in Australia too, is the debate about multiculturalism. But what makes multiculturalism a much more toxic issue in Australia, in Britain than in Australia, is you're having that debate in a context in which people don't want any newcomers anyway, right? Whereas we don't have that debate, or maybe a small sliver of opinion does, but not many people and nobody in the mainstream on either side. The second big reason is we just do multiculturalism a lot better. So our communities are much more multicultural, much more racially and ethnically diverse everywhere than is the case in the United Kingdom. I remember some years ago looking at a research paper by the Parliamentary Library about ethnic diversity in Australia. And it ranked the federal electorates in Australia by diversity. Now, this is more than 10 years ago, right? It would be different now. But according to this paper, the most monocultural part of Australia was the Sunshine Coast, the electorates of Fairfax and Fisher. So the white population, to put it crudely, the white population of Fairfax and Fisher was, if my memory serves me correctly, about 87%. That was the most monocultural. In the United Kingdom, you don't have to go very far out of London. Places like Dorset and Devon and Cornwall, the West Country, Shropshire, the West Midlands, in which the white population in some parts of England is 99.9%. So, whereas in London, I think is probably the most multicultural big city in the world, but it's also completely different from the rest of England. So the mixing up of ethnicities at every local level does not happen to nearly the same degree in the United Kingdom as it does in Australia. And at last point, one thing it's overlooked. It's overlooked because good news never makes the front page of the paper, but this is an Australian success story. We do settlement services really well in this country. Both sides of politics have always done settlement services very well. So we look after newcomers in partnership with private charitable and church and other civil society providers. They hardly do that at all in the United Kingdom. So we are more acculturated to the idea of a bigger population. We're more acculturated to the idea of a multicultural population. But we also go out of our way to make sure that people from everywhere in the world, but particularly, I guess, refugees and people who come from the minority ethnicities, are settled into Australia. That's a very advertent suite of policies that barely exist in the United Kingdom.
Which we have learned from the British.
Okay, questions?
Interesting.
Yeah, just on the issue of the council elections, which were a couple of months, I don't know, some period of time, I can't quite remember, before. I think
You mean the municipal elections in the UK?
Yes.
Not the Brisbane City Council.
So yes, sorry, no, municipal elections in the UK.
Yeah.
I think from what I saw, they were mainly used as sort of a litmus test for what the election was going to look like. But I especially looking at how many cities in the UK have sort of gone bankrupt and the discrepancies between the council and federal level. What is the impact of a change in governments, both in the council level and at the federal level, for especially things like austerity and funding towards those community efforts? And obviously, just one more thing before I phrase my question, but there's that stat that's often repeated about food banks and the fact that food banks rose, I think, dozens of times under a Tory government. What is going to be the impact, in your opinion, of a change of government, both on the federal level and on the local level, for sort of smaller and sort of, I guess, outside of London, these areas?
Well, it's a very good question. So what we've seen in the United Kingdom in the last 10 or 15 years, and you obviously know a lot about this, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. We've seen the sort of the aggregation of the big provincial cities, particularly Birmingham and Manchester, with the surrounding sort of peri-urban areas into sort of big sort of super local authorities. One of Starmer's, so there's a West Midlands Council, right? It's not just the city of Birmingham. One of Starmer's policies was to create a council of the regions. And I mean, this is very tricky in the United Kingdom because England, it's a 68 million population, right? But there are only 5 million people in Scotland. There are 2.5 million people in Wales. There are about 1.5 million people in the north of England. So overwhelmingly, it's England, right? So you can't really have a federation of the 4 nations. And so what Starmer wants to do is have a kind of, within England, have a sort of almost a tier of government comprising a council of the regions. And he also wants to get rid of the House of Lords, or sorry, the hereditary members of the House of Lords, who are only 92, by the way. And then there's this interesting discussion going on about whether the House of Lords will be elected, a bit like the Australian House of Lords, on a proportional representation basis, with the councils of the regions being the electoral colleges for different parts of the United Kingdom. Now, the problem with that is that nobody outside Scotland wants to see Scottish independence, and nothing's going to revive Scottish independence more than seeing 8 of the 12 regional electoral colleges for the new sort of House of Lords / Senate coming from England. So that's a problem as well. But I think you're right to identify the closer engagement of the central government, particularly with the big provincial cities and their attendant regions, as a big issue in British politics going forward.
Usually.
Senator, just a quick prediction. How long before Britain goes back to Europe?
Well, Eugene, Brendan, Michael O'Sullivan, I thought you'd ask me something like that. So I gave a speech at the beginning of last year saying it's not going to happen in this political generation because the public is just so exhausted by it. I mean, they just don't want to have this debate again. However, starting to revise, or at least sort of temporise that opinion, because if you look at the new House of Commons with its 411 Labor seats, there wouldn't be many Labor MPs who were in favour of Brexit. There'd be the odd one. There'd be the odd old crazy trot, who were hanging around from the Corbyn days. But there'd be a handful, right? Out of 411, I doubt there'd be, there might be 11, right? Of the 72 Lib Dems, they're all zealously against Brexit. The SNP are profoundly against Brexit. I haven't worked out how the Conservative Party, with their 121 seats, breaks up. But if you look at who the leadership contenders are, at least half, I think, were against Brexit. And then Farage's, he's Farage and his four kooky guys he's got sort of with him. I doubt there'd be more than about 10% of the House of Commons now who would say they like the idea of Britain having left the EU in 2016. I just wonder whether, and Starmer, by the way, very cleverly sort of parked that. Well, no, he didn't even park it, he ruled it out during the election campaign because he didn't want to sort of create a political rabbit hole for himself. So he said, we're not going to revisit Brexit. I just wonder, though, if you've got such an overwhelming body of opinion in the House of Commons, like, at least 85%, I reckon about 90%, against the status quo, whether or not how sustainable that is in the long run. Now, add to that the fact that Brexit is becoming increasingly unpopular. That was always going to happen up to a point because there's always going to be an implementation phase. The immediate effect was chloroformed by COVID, but now we're in the post-COVID era. So the opinion polls at the moment, remember it was 52-48 in 2016. The opinion polls at the moment, depending on which ones you look at, say maybe about 55, 56% of people are regret the decision to leave the EU. And then there is the fact that in 2016, one of the two biggest differentiations about voting intention was by age. So I'll give you some fascinating statistics. I mean, I know it's the worst way to kill a speech is to quote too many figures, but these are really interesting, so listen up. If you were 18 to 24, this is 8 years ago, 25% voted to leave and 75% voted to remain. And it went like that across every age demographic to the 66 to 74-year-olds, 66% were in favour of leaving and 34% were in favour of remaining. So 2.5 times more old people were in favour of leaving than young people. Now, a lot of that, the oldest demographic will have died off now, and the young demographic is, is a larger bit of the population graph. So you just have more people in the community, even if they haven't changed their minds, who belong to the anti-Brexit group. So those two things combined, the overwhelming and largely cross-party consensus in the Commons, and the growing number of people in the electorate who are in favour of who think Brexit was a mistake, makes me wonder. I wouldn't be surprised, depending on how things go in the next 4.5 years, if Starmer goes to the next election, which doesn't have to be until 2029, promising another referendum.
That's soon.
Possibly.
That's 5 years.
I wouldn't be surprised.
5 to 10.
If there are two quick questions, we can get two quick answers. We haven't had any female members of the audience ask a question. Oh, we got an online one?
Yes.
Good.
So from Tom Howe online.
Female. Asked by a female person, at least,
Yeah.
I suppose, it's something.
What do you make of the United Kingdom's tilt to the Indo-Pacific?
Well, it was an extremely important thing when it happened. It was part of a state paper called the Integrated Review that was published during the Johnson government. They meant it very seriously. I mean, the Johnson people, the Brexiteers, I think were wrongly caricatured as Little Englanders. They weren't. They had this sort of global vision of, and that was their slogan, Global Britain. And they meant it seriously. I mean, that's why they signed up to the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. And the tilt to the Indo-Pacific was serious. Now, because of all defence things, you know, it's ultimately resource driven. So they're not going to base one of their 2 aircraft carriers that doesn't work in our hemisphere. But the Labor Party took to the election a commitment to do an audit of Britain's Indo-Pacific policy. Now, as Paul and I both know as former politicians, when a politician says we're going to do an audit, what it means is that they're going to change their priorities. The Labor Party is much more interested in drawing back to a European focus. That has been, of course, reinforced by the Ukraine war, which has reminded them, you know, what a big trouble spot they've got close to home. The extent to which they have global ambitions, that they're to be seen in their aid and development policy, and they're focused on Africa. So I think you're going to see this Labor government, without actually saying so, in fact, begin to retreat on the tilt to the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, last question. Aha, we've got a woman, Rachel.
I'm interested in the extent to which the behaviour of the royal family, not the royal family itself, but some of the bad behaviour versus some of the good behaviour have any impact on the way Britons vote for their government and the way the government operates.
I don't think it has much. I mean, you know, I think we Australians don't understand how deeply embedded in their consciousness the royal family is. I was a bit surprised. I mean, even among people who will say, "Oh, you know, I'm a Republican." I mean, it's a deep part of their culture and their sense of themselves, and it's one thing that works. You say, and you know, and it gives glamour and prestige, and it might, you know, some cynical people might say, "Look, it's all smoke and mirrors." Well, it's not actually. I'll give you an example. Why are we saving so many endangered species? Because William and Harry, in the days when they spoke to each other, got very excited about endangered species. If the royal family want to put an issue on the agenda, and it became a priority of British foreign policy. So if the royal family want to put an issue on the agenda, it gets put on the agenda. The behind the scenes political and the broader cultural influence of the royal family is not to be underestimated. And we Australians always underestimate. We think it's a bit silly. I don't, but a lot of people do. As to bad behaviour, well, who's behaving badly except Harry and Meghan, and everybody hates them. They're sort of the antichrist of, you know. Every fairy tale has to have a villain, and they're the villains.
Well, I think you're getting King Charles out to do a critique of architecture in Brisbane. I reckon we can put out that. Look, can I thank you, George, for a wonderful speech tonight. It really was truly engaging, and your willingness to answer questions. It's always great to hear someone who not only is highly knowledgeable, but is capable of delivering that and imparting that knowledge in an entertaining fashion. So, on behalf of the audience and the AIIA, can I thank you for being here? One other thing before I call on Diana Lopez, are you doing the what's coming up? You're doing the what's coming up?
Okay.
All right. You know what's coming up?
No.
Ben?
Ingrid was going to give me the list.
All right. Is Ben doing the what's coming up? All right. Okay. There is one thing before we get Ben to do the what's coming up. And that is to tell you, as any guest speaker gets, you get a year's free membership of the AIIA Queensland branch, which is wonderful because we would hope, obviously you're based in Brisbane, notwithstanding you're frequently still an ANU in Canberra, we would hope to see you at some of our events. But again, thank you very much, George.
Thank you, Paul.
Really appreciate it.
Well done.
Hi everyone. We've got a few upcoming events in the next coming months. We've got a professor from the University of Queensland, I believe, Griffith University, Alberto Posso, who will speak on international migration and the Australian housing crisis. He wants to, he's sort of breaking down whether there's a relationship between those. We've got a very special event with Honorary Associate Professor Marion Hanson. She's also co-chair of ICANN. She will speak on the rise of nuclearism and if we are close to a nuclear catastrophe. That'll be on September 17. And we have a panel discussion on power and resistance in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. And they'll be speaking on women, minorities, and the larger diaspora there. So if you are not already a member, please consider joining, and we'll hopefully see you soon.